Hey guys, tonight we begin with the bizarre, ambitious and sometimes eyebrow-free world of medieval beauty standards. A world where the goal wasn't to look healthy, but rather like someone who'd just been politely exercised. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the medieval world, looking pale wasn't a sign that you needed more sleep. It was a fashion statement, a social flex, a silent announcement to the world that said, "I am too rich to ever see the sun. Thank you very much." Unlike today, where a healthy glow might suggest yoga, smoothies, or a trip to the coast, medieval beauty flipped the script. Tan skin. That meant you worked outside, which meant you were poor, which meant gasp, manual labor. And nothing said not beautiful in the 14th century, like knowing how to milk a cow. So, the paler you were, the higher your perceived status. And when we say pale, we don't mean a soft ivory glow. We're talking translucent porcelain with vascular undertones, skin so light it looked like you might have been recently startled by a ghost or were a ghost. Of course, nature doesn't always cooperate, especially if you were born with an actual working circulatory system. So, people helped it along. Noble women and even men occasionally would apply white lead powder to their faces. It provided that signature corpse chic glow, and as a bonus, slowly poisoned you. But beauty has always had its price. Some would use vinegar-soaked cloths to bleach their skin. Others applied a mixture of crushed pearls and egg whites, which not only lightened the face, but also had the side effect of making one's cheeks feel like a stale omelette. Veins were sometimes painted onto the arms and chest using blue pigment to simulate delicacy, because nothing says noble like pretending your skin is about to split open. Even literature got in on it. Romantic poems described women as pale as milk, white as snow, and once one as the moon in winter, which is a nice way of saying she looks like she might faint. I love it. This pale aesthetic wasn't just about beauty. It was shorthand for class, purity, and complete economic disengagement with agriculture. If you could afford to be fragile, you were winning. Beauty in the Middle Ages often required commitment. And by commitment, we mean a slow, decorative form of chemical warfare on yourself. Because for those striving to achieve that prestigious pale complexion, nature just wasn't enough. So they reached for makeup, specifically lead-based white face powder. Yes, lead, as in the thing we now seal off old buildings for. But back then it was considered cutting edge. The result was a smooth, pale, matte finish, the medieval equivalent of high D foundation. It made the skin look flawless, and eventually feel very not flawless. White lead powder was made by combining vinegar and metal, then allowing it to corrode into a white crust that could be ground into a fine powder. Apply that daily and voila, you looked like a luminous, delicate aristocrat with a secret death wish. And if your skin began to flake, blister or fall off in small diplomatic chunks, even better. It meant the makeup was working. Probably this wasn't a one-product routine either. Many added mercury-based rouge for color or chalk dust for more staying power. Egg whites were brushed over the face for a smooth, glazed look. Basically, if it came from a barn or an alchemist's shelf, someone had rubbed it on their face in the name of elegance. The downside, other than the obvious slow poisoning, lead-based products caused everything from chronic fatigue and skin ulcers to hair loss and premature death, which is not listed on most modern skin-in-care labels. But the fashion endured, because if the choice was between dying slowly and being mistaken for a peasant, nobility often chose the scenic route to the grave. Men weren't always immune either. Some male courtiers also used powders or skin treatments, especially in the later medieval and early Renaissance courts, where image mattered almost as much as lineage, or at least as much as smelling less terrible than your rival. Of all the medieval beauty trends, the obsession with high foreheads may be the most eyebrow-raising, literally because people were removing their eyebrows for it. A tall, smooth, uninterrupted forehead wasn't just fashionable. It was considered elegant, intelligent, and divine. It was the architectural marvel of the medieval face. The ideal forehead said, "I spend my days reading psalms and looking pensively out of castle windows, not I own a shovel." To achieve this noble look, women went to extreme and frankly itchy measures. Eyebrows were plucked out completely, and sometimes even scalp hair was removed inch by inch to push the hairline further back. This wasn't a trim. This was a full-on forehead expansion project. Medieval grooming manuals advised women to use tweezers, hot cloths, and depilatory creams made from things like cat dung, quicklime, or vinegar-soaked leeches, all in the name of showcasing a forehead that could double as a sundial. The results were striking. Portraits from the time show women with serene expressions and foreheads so vast you could host a joust on them. Combined with pale skin and soft facial features, this high-dome aesthetic became shorthand for refined beauty. It wasn't all about the face, either. Fashion supported this look. Tight-fitting hoods, wimples and hennins, those famous cone-shaped hats, all helped pull the hairline up, or at least hide the part where your eyebrows used to live. And this wasn't just some isolated castle trend. From England to France to Italy, noble women leaned into the high forehead style, while artists and poets reinforced it by praising women whose faces began somewhere near the crown of the head. Of course, not everyone could afford the time or tools to pluck themselves into perfection. So in a moment of medieval ingenuity, some women faked it by drawing their new foreheads slightly higher and covering the rest with headbands or veils. That's right. The Middle Ages had their own version of contouring. It just involved a lot more fabric. In medieval Europe, eyebrows weren't just underappreciated, they were actively eliminated. Modern trends may celebrate bold brows, feathered arches, and TikTok tutorials. But in the 14th and 15th centuries, eyebrows were seen as unnecessary facial clutter. To achieve the ideal look, women plucked their eyebrows into near non-existence or erased them entirely. Why? Because a bare, smooth forehead was considered elegant and refined, and any sign of actual hair growth interrupted the aesthetic. Eyebrows were basically seen as stubborn weeds on the garden of the face. Some went even further and shaved the brow area completely, ensuring that not a single strand interfered with their alabaster hide glory. It's the sort of commitment that would make modern beauty influencers blink twice, mostly because there were no brow pencils to draw them back in. To remove the brows, medieval women used tweezers, wax, pumice stones, or for the especially brave, mixtures containing quicklime, vinegar, or arsenic. Yes, arsenic, because nothing says dedication to your look like risking mild facial melting. This was more than just a passing fad. Art from the period, from illuminated manuscripts to oil portraits, confirms the trend. Noble women are frequently depicted with smooth foreheads and expressionless eyes framed by nothing but skin. The result is either serene or slightly alien. Depends on the lighting. Interestingly, the no-brow trend wasn't entirely uniform. In some parts of Europe, thin or lightly arched brows persisted, especially as influences from the Middle East and Byzantine Empire filtered through trade and war. But by and large, the message was clear. If people can see your eyebrows, you're doing it wrong. And this wasn't just for women. Men, especially those close to court life, occasionally trimmed or groomed their brows as part of a larger aesthetic of refinement, though full removal was rare among males, unless they'd lost them in a particularly heated theological debate. What this all tells us is that medieval beauty ideals weren't about looking natural. They were about looking curated, symbolic, and just a bit angelic. Angels, after all, rarely have brows in art. Coincidence? Possibly, but it worked for them. In the Middle Ages, having a touch of colour in your cheeks was desirable. But like most things in medieval life, there were rules, social risks, and a vague chance of damnation. The ideal was a subtle blush, like you just heard a mildly scandalous poem or stepped outdoors for 30 seconds, but not long enough to tan. Heaven forbid. A gentle rose hue on the cheeks suggested youth, fertility, and general survival. All things that were considered attractive, particularly if you could maintain them past the age of 28. But you couldn't look like you were trying. Applying rouge was considered vain, and vanity was suspiciously close to sin. The church was not amused by women smearing colour on their faces, unless, of course, they were nobility or doing it humbly, which is a theological grey area scholars are still trying to define. Still, women improvised. Common blush ingredients included beetroot juice, crushed strawberries, mulberries, or even coin, a deep red pigment made from crushed insects. Yes, bugs, because beauty has never been kind. Some rubbed their cheeks to get that natural flush, while others used mixtures of red ochre or wine sediment dabbed carefully to avoid detection by both clergy and judgmental neighbours. For the wealthy, rouge could be made from red lead or cinnabar, both of which were incredibly toxic. But the logic went something like, I may die young, but I'll die pink-cheeked and socially respected. Rouge was typically applied with cloth, fingers, or whatever tool was available that hadn't just been used to season a stew. Mirror access was limited. So many women relied on instinct, muscle memory, or the occasional honest maid. Of course, if your blush was too visible, you might be accused of imitating prostitutes or worse, French courtiers. The horror. The goal was always modest enhancement, not theatrical statement. And if someone complimented your glow, you were expected to deny everything and mutter something about the wind. Even nuns occasionally wore a touch of rouge discreetly and supposedly only on feast days. Because nothing says, I serve the Lord, like a tasteful dab of beetroot behind the cloister. In medieval Europe, if your hair didn't look like it had been kissed by holy light or stolen from a bottle angel, you were already starting from behind. Blonde hair in particular was the medieval gold standard. It was associated with youth, beauty, virtue, and in case you needed divine backup, the Virgin Mary was frequently painted as a blonde, even though she was geographically speaking almost certainly not, but realism was less important than radiance. If you were born blonde, congratulations. You were considered blessed and probably got out of a few chores. But natural blondness didn't last, especially in adulthood. So medieval women took matters into their own hands and sometimes cauldrons. Homemade hair-lightening concoctions included saffron, chamomile, ash, honey, and lye. Applied liberally, then left to bake under the sun in a method known as sunbasking. It worked best if you had the patience of a nun and the skin of a salamander. Some recipes also included urine, which was thought to help lift colour. Whose urine? That part was less regulated, but as long as it gave your hair that celestial shimmer, it was deemed worth it. Beauty is, and always has been, a little bit disgusting. Hair texture mattered too. Loose, long, wavy locks were the ideal, preferably cascading down your back like a divine curtain. But this luxury was reserved for unmarried women. Once married, your golden mane was to be hidden under veils, nets, and head wraps. Because apparently, the moment you said, I do, your hair became a national security risk. For noble women, hair was often braided, twisted, or tucked into elaborate styles, especially when attending court or religious events. These hairstyles were frequently accessorized with silk ribbons, beads, or embroidery, just in case you needed to remind the room you didn't shear sheep for a living. Men weren't left out either. While not quite as judged, men with thick golden locks were often romanticized in poetry and art. Knights with flowing hair charging into battle were the medieval version of shampoo commercials. In medieval Europe, hair was a lot like money. If you had it, you didn't necessarily show it off unless you were trying to get married. Then suddenly, it became a strategic asset. Unmarried women were encouraged to wear their hair long and loose as a symbol of purity and innocence, though not too loose, unless you were going for the ethereal forest maiden look, which was only socially acceptable if you were, say, an actual saint or being martyred. Otherwise, a gentle braid would suffice, but once married, your hair was immediately banished from public view. Congratulations, you now had a husband and an obligation to wrap your locks tighter than a monastery's wine budget. Enter the world of veils, wimples, nets, and kifs, a medieval wardrobe of modesty that could make even the most radiant blonde disappear under 3 layers of beige linen. These coverings weren't just modest, they were practical. They protected hair from smoke, lice, and unsolicited compliments from troubadours. The most dedicated women layered their coverings. A coif, a close-fitting cap, might be worn under a veil, which could then be pinned beneath a wimple that wrapped under the chin. The effect, you looked like a pious, well-bundled sandwich, and that was the goal. But fashion is rarely satisfied with just function. As time went on, headwear got more elaborate. Nets were embroidered with gold thread. Veils were starched into geometric shapes. Some noble women wore silken cages for their braids, accessorized with jewels and tiny bells, because nothing says subtle beauty like jingling when you turn your head. In many cultures, concealed hair was tied to morality. A covered head was seen as modest and virtuous. Exposed hair on a married woman, however, could get you compared to a lady of the night, or worse, a French woman. Of course, some women rebelled. They would let a little curl slip out or wear translucent veils that technically counted as covered, while still letting the world admire their carefully dyed strands. Medieval loopholes were alive and well. If medieval beauty had one unspoken rule, it was this: taller is nobler. And we're not talking about your legs. By the 15th century, women across Europe began embracing a fashion trend that quite literally elevated their appearance. The hennin. You know the one. Those towering cone-shaped hats that looked like they were designed by someone who spent too much time around church steeples. The hennin wasn't just headwear. It was a social ladder you wore. These hats could reach upwards of 2 hectares, sometimes even more, especially among the French and Burgundian elite. The taller the hennin, the higher your status, and the more doors you smacked into on your way to dinner. Often made from fine silk, velvet, or brocade, hennins were structured with wire frames, giving them that dangerously aerodynamic shape. A sheer veil usually cascaded from the tip, adding movement, mystery, and a good chance of getting caught in candles. Now, getting your hair to fit under one of these things was an art in itself. Hair was braided and stuffed up into the cone, or sometimes completely shaved around the forehead. Forehead real estate again, to help the hennin sit properly. Comfort was not part of the design brief, but hennins weren't the only vertical obsession. Some women wore heart-shaped escarpons, which looked like 2 croissants glued to either side of the head, or butterfly hennins, where veils were spread out like wings. Great for drama, not so much for rain. Outside of nobility, most women stuck with veils, linen caps or surlets, simpler, less dangerous, and less likely to be mistaken for a siege weapon. Clergy and conservative thinkers, as expected, were less than enthused. They warned that such ostentation invited vanity, sin, and possibly neck strain. Still, hennins remained popular among those who could afford them, much like most terrible but fashionable ideas throughout history. And while men didn't wear towering cones, they had their own style statements. Think feathered caps, fur-trimmed hoods, and pointy shoes that could double as fencing equipment. In medieval times, a woman's ideal body wasn't meant to be athletic, curvy, or toned. No, the goal was to appear delicate, demure, and possibly recovering from a fainting spell. The ideal figure was slim, soft, and slightly ethereal, like someone who lived on honey water, courtly poems, and perhaps one figure weak. Beauty manuals didn't advise women to build strength or endurance. The only lifting expected of you was lifting your veil in a flirtatious gesture before swiftly looking away and maybe swooning. But this wasn't about looking sickly, at least not obviously. The sweet spot was somewhere between too weak to carry a bucket and still able to play the lute while sitting. A graceful, willowy figure was associated with nobility because, of course, if you were working, you'd have broader shoulders, stronger arms, and the misfortune of muscle tone. The emphasis was on a narrow waist, soft curves, and a general air of spiritual exhaustion. Waistlines on dresses were often cinched just below the bust, an early version of the empire waist to elongate the torso and give the illusion of height and fragility. And if that illusion needed help, tight lacing was available. Not quite corsets, those came later, but tightly bound kirtles and sir did the job just fine. Being too thin, however, wasn't the goal either. In times of famine or plague, being very thin was a red flag, as in that person might be actively dying. A small hint of roundness, particularly in the face or hips, was considered healthy and fertile. Basically, if you looked like you could survive winter and still be poetic, you were in the sweet spot. Diet advice from the time wasn't exactly balanced. Beauty manuals recommended things like eating fennel for digestion, rose petals for breath, and drinking wine to improve complexion. Protein only if it had a feather still attached. Men, on the other hand, were allowed to have more substance, broad shoulders, strong legs, and the ability to carry a sword without toppling over. But even then, nobility preferred a lean frame with refined posture, not brute strength. In the Middle Ages, a woman's eyes were her silent power. The medieval version of sending a flirty emoji, only with more spiritual implications and slightly less blinking. The ideal medieval eyes were large, clear and soulful, the kind that seemed to whisper, "I'm full of virtue," and maybe just a hint of melancholy. Think of eyes that looked as if they had personally witnessed the fall of man and were still politely recovering. Poets of the period couldn't get enough of them. They described eyes as luminous orbs, dewdrops of heaven, or pools of pure devotion. What they rarely said was bloodshot, allergy-ridden, or I was up all night churning butter. Light-colored eyes, blue or grey, were often idealized in Northern Europe, associated with innocence, purity, and the general assumption that you hadn't seen too many disturbing things, or at least pretended not to. In Southern Europe, darker eyes were admired too, especially if they came paired with a noble lineage and a good doughy. Enhancing the eyes was challenging. There were no medieval eyeliner pens, just charcoal soot and optimism. Some women dabbed a little black powder around the lashes to make the eyes look bigger, risking irritation, blurry vision, or starting the world's first accidental smoky eye. But most women relied on nature and strategic lighting. Want to look more wide-eyed? Stand near a candle. Want to look virtuous? Look downward at all times, even if you trip over the cat. Interestingly, slightly tearary eyes were admired. It suggested emotional sensitivity, piety, and perhaps that you just finished praying or reading something uplifting, like a 300-line poem about chastity. Artificial tears weren't available, but staring directly into smoke or enduring mild public humiliation usually did the trick. As for eye contact, it was a delicate dance. Too much could be seen as bold, flirtatious, or suspiciously French. Too little, and you risked seeming shifty or possessed. The trick was to occasionally glance up from beneath lowered lids, like someone who'd memorized the Bible but wasn't about to brag. Let's talk about something rarely mentioned in medieval love poetry. Breath, specifically what it smelled like. While a knight might wax lyrical about his lady's rosebud lips or pearl-like teeth, he usually skipped over what happened when those lips opened. That's because medieval dental hygiene was at best an aspirational concept. and minty freshness wasn't invented yet, unless you count standing near a herb garden and hoping for the best. Still, fresh breath was technically considered desirable. A gentle, sweet-smelling mouth hinted at youth, health, and that you probably hadn't eaten garlic and eels for breakfast. Though statistically you had. Medieval women did what they could. They chewed parsley, fennel seeds, cloves, cinnamon sticks, and occasionally twigs. Not just for the taste, but to keep the mouth tolerable. Think of it as the pre-mint version of gum. It didn't sparkle your teeth, but it made you slightly more kissable, or at least less terrifying in close conversation. For those with access to apothecaries, there were also herbal pastes and mouth rinses made from sage, vinegar, and myrrh. These were applied sparingly, both because they were expensive and because opening your mouth too wide in public was considered a bit much. Toothbrushing, as we know it, wasn't standard. Instead, people wiped their teeth with cloth, rubbed them with chalk or crushed herbs, or used chew sticks, small fibrous twigs that could scrub and double as something to fidget with while your suitor recited bad poetry. And while ptosis wasn't exactly romantic, it wasn't considered shocking either. After all, everyone had bad breath to some degree, and they all had bigger problems, like surviving winter or avoiding being burned as a heretic. For noble women, the trick was to minimize offense while maintaining grace. Conversations took place at arm's length. Public affection was limited. And when in doubt, fan yourself and look contemplative. Bonus points if you carried a small pomander, a scented orb filled with herbs to wave gently in your own direction as needed. In modern times, a great smile can launch 1,000 dating apps. In the Middle Ages, a smile was a risky endeavor, best used sparingly, like spices or peasant revolts. Why? Well, medieval dental hygiene wasn't exactly flourishing. Teeth were important, yes, but more for chewing bread than charming suitors. Most people had teeth that ranged from slightly questionable to actively terrifying, especially by age 30, so the fewer people saw them, the better. This wasn't entirely due to negligence. Tooth decay was rampant, thanks to diets heavy in bread, porridge and mead, and lacking in toothbrushes, dental floss, or literally any kind of fluoride. Sugar wasn't widely consumed yet in most of Europe, but even basic starches broke down into tooth-tarnishing misery. Also, dental surgery at the time was essentially an exorcism with pliers. Despite this, a healthy smile was quietly admired, just not loudly celebrated. White, even teeth were rare, and seen as a mark of youth and fortune, and perhaps a miracle. But people weren't going around flashing big toothy grins like medieval toothpaste commercials. In fact, a demure closed lip smile was far more fashionable. Think I might be contemplating a sonnet rather than I'm thrilled to be here. Some women even used powders made of sage, salt, or ground-up coral to try and clean or whiten their teeth. These methods were mildly effective and mostly abrasive. Imagine brushing with sand and hoping for the best, but overall teeth were tolerated, not flaunted. Medieval art, for instance, almost never depicts open-mouthed smiles. Even saints and angels usually keep their mouths politely closed, as if they too were quietly aware of the risks of showing mirrors. Men weren't immune either. A knight might win the heart of a lady with his bravery and chiseled jawline, but no ballad ever included the line, "Hispids gleamed like ivory." There's a reason Troubadour sang about eyes, hair and hands, not breath and bite alignment. When it came to medieval beauty standards for men, the expectations were oddly specific. You didn't need to be chiseled like a Greek statue, but you also couldn't look like you'd just fallen off a hay cart. The sweet spot was somewhere between ready to joust and could write a poem about jousting without actually doing it. The ideal man was tall, lean, broad-shouldered, and very importantly, nobly unbothered. Not overly muscular, that suggested labor, but not soft either. That suggested laziness or too much me. You wanted to look like you could swing a sword, but only if the squire was busy. A defined jawline, high cheekbones and a straight nose were all considered attractive. Think prince in an illuminated manuscript rather than village strongman. A well-groomed beard or a smooth, clean-shaven face was acceptable, depending on the region and era. But either way, it needed to look intentional, not like you'd been lost in the woods for a week. Hair was typically shoulder-length and styled, especially for noblemen. Curls were in fashion in many courts, especially if they occurred naturally or looked like they did. Some men even used curling irons. Yes, really, small heated rods or herbal rinses to enhance texture and shine. Because nothing says I'm above manual labor, like sitting for 45 minutes while your page boy styles your fringe. Clothing played a huge role in enhancing the male silhouette. Padded shoulders, cinched waists, and fitted tunics helped create the ideal body shape with extra emphasis on posture. A nobleman did not slouch. He glided, often with a hint of disdain, and if a man did happen to be naturally muscular, that was fine, as long as he wasn't caught actually working with those muscles. Fighting in wars was acceptable. Hauling barrels was not. Above all, the look was effortless. You weren't supposed to try to be attractive, you were simply born noble, and that alone made you appealing. A kind of medieval version of hot without trying, except instead of a gym membership, you inherited land and a falcon. In an era where bathing was technically optional and plumbing was mostly a dream with a Latin name, scent management became an art form. And not the glamorous walk through a cloud of Chanel No. 5 kind of art, more the Massette and Prey variety. To be fair, people did bathe, just not as often as we'd hope, especially depending on the century, location, and plague frequency. So to keep from offending nostrils, human and divine, medieval men and women turned to the electric power of herbs, oils, and perfume pouches. Let's begin with the commander. A small hollow ball made of metal worn on a chain or pinned to clothing and filled with strongly scented herbs like cloves, rosemary, cinnamon, sage, and occasionally something ominously labeled powder of roses. These weren't just for elegance, they were portable smell shields. Think of them as the medieval version of walking around with a freezy grenade. The nobility also favored perfumed gloves, handkerchiefs, and even scented combs. Everything was fair game for aroma enhancement, including hair, which was sometimes doused with floral waters, or vinegar infusions that smelled slightly better than sweat and desperation. Speaking of sweat, yes, people absolutely sweated. Medieval garments were heavy, summers were hot, and deodorant was still several centuries away from reinventing armpits. The solution, layers of linen, which absorbed sweat and could be washed more frequently than the woolen or silk outer garments. Some added herbal sachets to their underlayers, hoping to combat odor with fragrant optimism. Betus were a thing, especially during the early medieval and late medieval periods, but access varied wildly. The church eventually frowned upon communal nudity, which really put a damper on hygiene enthusiasm. So many turned to dry bathing, which is exactly as unrefreshing as it sounds. Wiping yourself with a cloth, then spritzing on scented water and pretending that counted. And then there were the overachievers. People who kept flower petals in their shoes or stuffed herbs in their bed linens to smell vaguely, like someone who had recently seen a garden. In medieval Europe, beauty wasn't just skin deep. It was morally loaded. A well-composed face could be a divine blessing, a social weapon, or a trap set by the devil himself. Sometimes all three before breakfast. To be beautiful was to walk a very fine line. On one hand, physical beauty, clear skin, symmetrical features, pale complexion, was considered a sign of virtue. If you were lovely, it meant you were blessed, possibly chosen by God, or at the very least unlikely to steal sheep. Poets, preachers, and painters alike described beauty as evidence of a pure soul. But there was a catch. If you knew you were beautiful, or worse, if you used that beauty to your advantage, you immediately became suspect. Vanity was a sin, remember? and showing too much interest in one's appearance hinted at pride, seduction, or worst of all, French tendencies. Medieval sermons warned that women's beauty could tempt men into sin, which of course was entirely the woman's fault. Eve set a precedent, and medieval Europe ran with it for a solid 1,000 years. A woman wearing makeup, showing a bit of hair, or fluttering her lashes at the wrong night could easily find herself accused of being everything from immoral to outright demonic. Some even believed that beauty could be an illusion, a sorceress's disguise, a glamour conjured by witches to lead righteous men astray. This may sound dramatic, but remember, this was a time when bad weather could get you burned at the stake. Conversely, those who were plain or ill-featured were sometimes assumed to be morally deficient or just unfortunate. The idea that outward appearance reflected in a character wasn't just popular. It was doctrine in some circles. Beauty meant grace. Ugliness meant punishment, illness, or divine disappointment. Of course, all of this made things spectacularly confusing. Be beautiful, but don't try too hard. Glow with virtue, but not so much that it looks like pride. And above all, never look more attractive than the local lord's wife. That was a one-way ticket to a silent convent or an unusually convenient illness. So, in the end, medieval beauty standards weren't just about aesthetics. They were a full-blown moral tightrope, balancing vanity, virtue, and whatever powdered lead was left in your makeup kit. The Persian immortals were more than just elite troops. They were a statement, a living symbol of imperial strength, precision, and unyielding continuity. Their origins trace back to the very birth of the Achaemenid Empire under Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BCE. At a time when Persia was rapidly transforming from a regional power into a sprawling imperial juggernaut, Cyrus understood something vital. An empire needs a backbone. Not just administrators and governors, but an elite force that could project dominance, inspire loyalty, and suppress rebellion with equal efficiency. Thus, the Immortals were born. The name Immortals wasn't just a bit of royal flair. It was a logistical and psychological masterpiece. According to Herodotus, their strength was always kept exactly at 10,000 men. If one man died, fell ill, or was wounded, he was instantly replaced. The numbers never wavered. From the outside, it seemed they could not be diminished, could not be weakened, and above all, could not die. Whether myth or clever bookkeeping, the image stuck, and the name endured. Immortality, in this case, wasn't about individual survival. It was about the eternal presence of Persian might. These men weren't random conscripts. To be an immortal meant being selected from among the Persian nobility, or at least from families of high status and proven loyalty. Training began young, discipline was brutal, loyalty to the king unquestionable. They were expected to be not just warriors, but exemplars of aid values, order, obedience and composure under pressure. They were also richly dressed, robes of fine materials, scale armor beneath their garments, and often armed with a spear, bow, short sword, and a wicker shield. Their appearance was as calculated as their tactics. Persian kings weren't just sending warriors into battle. They were sending a mobile political message wrapped in silk and steel. From the plains of Lydia to the deserts of Egypt, wherever the Persian Empire expanded, the Immortals followed. They stood behind kings, beside thrones, and at the front of the battlefield. If you saw them approaching, you didn't just see soldiers. You saw the unbroken heartbeat of the empire. Immortals didn't blink. Immortals didn't retreat. Immortals endured. And that's exactly what made them terrifying. The appearance of the Persian Immortals was no accident. It was psychological warfare. These men weren't covered head to toe in gleaming bronze like Greek hoplites. No, the Immortals looked otherworldly, like a wave of richly dressed shadows sweeping across the land. Their uniforms blended regal flair with military function. They wore elaborately embroidered tunics and trousers, often dyed in rich reds and purples. colors of nobility and command. Beneath these lay a layer of scale armor made of bronze or iron, flexible enough for movement, but deadly in close combat. Their shields were made from woven wicker, deceptively light, yet able to deflect arrows and absorb blows. Their most distinctive element, however, was their headdress, a soft felt cap called a tiara, sometimes pulled over the face to obscure identity. Unlike the Greeks, who glorified individuality in armor and valor, the immortals thrived in uniformity. 10,000 men moving in near silence, all similarly armed and armored, created a visual spectacle that overwhelmed the senses. It was like watching a curtain of death descend on the battlefield. Each immortal carried a short spear, a bow with a quiver of arrows, and a short sword or a belt. But perhaps most impressive was their ability to move quickly and remain deadly in almost any terrain. Their training emphasized agility and endurance over brute strength. They could march across entire provinces without breaking formation, and unlike many ancient forces, the immortals were equally comfortable fighting in open battle or serving as imperial guards in royal courts. Their equipment was light enough to ensure swift deployment, but potent enough to intimidate and destroy. It wasn't about brute force. It was about consistency, about never failing, never staggering, and never seeming vulnerable. And that consistency, combined with the mystery of their appearance, helped forge their legend. When they marched into battle, drums would pound and dust would rise behind them, but their expressions remained eerily composed. No roaring, no boasting, just eerie, synchronized precision. It was as though they were not men, but machines crafted not in flesh, but in discipline, ritual, and fear. To face the immortals wasn't simply to face death. It was to face a concept that some armies didn't just fight. They endured without pause or pity. To be an immortal was not just a job. It was a lifelong identity, a status symbol, and in some ways, a sentence. While they were revered and richly rewarded, the expectations were immense. These men lived under constant scrutiny. Their food, clothing, and housing were all provided by the state, but not out of kindness. It was to ensure absolute control. From the moment they entered the ranks, they belonged not to their families, but to the empire. Most immortals came from Persian, Median, or Elamite nobility, but lower-ranking sons of loyal families could rise into the ranks if they showed exceptional discipline. Training began in childhood, often within military maize attached to the royal court. Boys learned archery on horseback, how to endure pain and hunger, how to march in step, and most importantly, how to obey without hesitation. There was no room for glory-seeking or personal ambition. An immortal who stood out too much was corrected. The formation was sacred. Unity came above all. Discipline ruled every corner of their lives. They followed a strict daily routine. Wake before dawn, drill in silence, maintain weapons and armor. Meals were eaten communally, always modest, always nutritionally calculated for endurance. Meat, flatbread, dates and wine were staples. But luxuries were discouraged. The empire needed warriors, not pampered aristocrats. When not on campaign, the immortals served as guards for the king and his court. But even then, their duties were more than ceremonial. They stood watch for assassination attempts, monitored nobles for disloyalty, and maintained order in the most volatile places of the empire. Their mere presence could silence dissent in a royal hall. They were the eyes and ears of the Achaemenid ruler, trained to detect lies, sense fear, and act decisively. Interestingly, they weren't entirely cut off from family life. Immortals were allowed to marry and maintain households. However, they could be summoned at a moment's notice. When duty called, they left everything behind, no questions asked. A man who hesitated even once could be quietly replaced. After all, the number always had to remain at 10,000. No gaps, no delays. It was this cold, efficient system that ensured their mythos. They didn't just fight with discipline. They lived in discipline. They were tools of empire, honed, polished and sharpened until nothing remained but duty. If Cyrus the Great created the immortals, it was Darius the Great who perfected them. When Darius rose to power in 522 BCE amid palace intrigue and assassination, the immortals were the tool he used to legitimize and stabilize his reign. They were no longer just a personal guard. They were an extension of royal authority, woven directly into the fabric of his expanding imperial bureaucracy. Darius understood that power didn't only rest on military strength, but on the illusion of order and inevitability. And nothing projected that image more effectively than the immortals. He paraded them at festivals, had them stationed prominently around his new capital of Pipiles, and sent them on high-profile missions. They were always visible, always composed, always the same. 10,000 eternal faces of Persian dominance. But Darius also reshaped their tactical role. Under his leadership, the immortals became a core element of Persian combined arms warfare. No longer just elite infantry, they were often deployed alongside archers, cavalry, and chariotry in coordinated strikes. Darius placed immense value on strategic flexibility, and the immortals had to adapt. They trained more rigorously in ranged combat, siege warfare, and battlefield coordination. Reports from later Greek observers describe how they moved with terrifying efficiency, firing arrows in volleys, while slowly advancing behind their wicker shields, never breaking formation. They also became heavily involved in suppressing rebellions. Darius's empire stretched from Egypt to the Indus Valley, and revolts were frequent. The immortals were often the first wave of retaliation in Elam, Babylon, and Syria. They acted as both punishment and message. The empire is watching, and the king's will is inexhaustible. It was under Darius that they earned a darker reputation. Not just elite warriors, but instruments of fear and retribution. Even their iconography was elevated. Carvings at Pepilolis show them in perfect lines, stylized and identical, facing eternity in stone. These weren't mere portraits. They were propaganda. Darius wanted every subject and visitor to know, these men are always here, always armed, and they do not die. Step out of line, and you'll meet 1 or 10,000. Through Darius, the immortals became more than a military unit. They were institutionalized fear, woven into the royal image, deployed with surgical precision and wrapped in gold-threaded silence. The Persian immortals reached the height of their legend during the reign of Xerxes the Great, and nowhere was their reputation more fiercely tested than at the narrow mountain pass of Thermopylae in 480 BCE. This battle, now mythologized through centuries of art and cinema, wasn't just a clash of armies. It was a symbolic collision between two radically different worldviews. Persian imperial order versus Greek city-state defiance, and at the center of the storm stood the immortals. When Xerxes invaded Greece with what ancient sources claimed was the largest army the world had ever seen, he brought the immortals as his personal vanguard. They didn't just guard him, they were a scalpel in the heart of chaos. Their reputation alone preceded them. The Greeks had heard of the 10,000 who never died, the elite troops who served kings like gods and fought with flawless precision. At Thermopylae, they met resistance that rattled their mythos. King Leonidas and his few thousand Greeks, most famously 300 Spartans, held the narrow pass against wave after wave of Persian attacks. On the second day of battle, Xerxes ordered the immortals to break the Greek line. It was meant to be a crushing blow. After all, these were the elite of the elite. But what followed was not the instant rout Xerxes expected. The immortals, skilled as they were constrained by the tight geography of the pass. Their bows were nearly useless in such confined space, and their shorter spears couldn't reach past the long dory of the Greek hoplites. For hours they clashed with disciplined Spartans who fought in tight interlocking phalanxes, trained from childhood for exactly this kind of combat. The immortals suffered losses, heavy ones. Herodotus noted, perhaps with some glee, that they were no more successful than the ordinary troops. It wasn't just a military defeat, it was a rupture in their image. The immortals had always appeared untouchable, gods of war in silk and scale. But at Thermop they bled, they died, and for the first time the illusion of their immortality cracked under the weight of Spartan spears and Greek defiance. Yet even in defeat, they remained terrifying. They adapted, they regrouped, and they marched again. Immortality, after all, wasn't about invincibility. It was about endurance. The most fascinating part of the Persian immortals wasn't just their training or battlefield tactics, it was their system. What truly made them immortal wasn't magic or divine favor. It was administration. Cold, efficient, relentless bureaucracy. When one immortal fell, whether in battle due to illness or by retirement, another took his place instantly. No mourning, no ceremony, just a seamless substitution. The total number always remained exactly 10,000. This wasn't a poetic exaggeration. It was by design. The Achaemenid Empire ran on logistics, and the immortals were the prime example. They had a constantly maintained pool of trainees and understudies, young men being groomed to fill vacancies the moment they appeared. These replacements were kept in the capital, supervised, drilled, and rotated through lesser duties until called up. This internal structure made the immortals far more than a static elite unit. They were a living system of excellence, always regenerating, always evolving. To facilitate this, records were kept with meticulous care. Officers known as Hazarapatis, literally commander of 1,000, oversaw recruitment, discipline, and supply. There were 10 such commanders beneath the overall leader of the immortals. Below them, a web of sub-commanders, scribes, and quartermasters ensured every man had the correct arms, rations, lodging, and medical support. Lose a man in Egypt. A replacement is dispatched from Suwa. A soldier breaks a leg during patrol in Media. His successor is already packing his gear. This machinery extended beyond just military readiness. It was psychological. The illusion of 10,000 unchanging warriors was a tool of imperial terror. If you killed one, another immediately stepped into his place. It didn't matter who they were individually. The identity was irrelevant. The presence was eternal. Like a hydra of discipline and silk, the immortals created the illusion of unstoppable force because the machine never paused to grieve. Even off the battlefield, this system functioned flawlessly. If an immortal's family became disloyal or politically compromised, he was quietly removed and replaced. No scandal, no drama. The line moved forward as if nothing had changed. This mechanism, so alien compared to the glory-seeking Greek ethos, was perhaps the immortals' greatest strength, not skill, not courage, but the cold certainty that they could never truly disappear. While the Persian immortals are remembered as warriors, they were also something far subtler, diplomats in armor. In the Achaemenid worldview, military force wasn't just about conquest, it was about presence. And the immortals were often deployed not just to fight, but to be seen, to enter foreign courts as living representations of Persian elegance and power. Their silken robes, gilded weapons, and perfect discipline made them terrifying in battle, but mesmerizing in peace. When ambassadors arrived in foreign lands, the immortals often accompanied them, not for protection, but as spectacle. Imagine a small elite escort entering a Greek or Babylonian city. 10 men, perfectly synchronized, dressed not in rough leather or blood-stained bronze, but in fine tunics laced with gold, silent and unreadable, behind their soft felt headdresses. They didn't shout or threaten. They didn't need to. Their very existence was a negotiation. In satrapies' provinces, immortals were regularly stationed to remind local governors where true power resided. They rarely interfered with civil rule, but they were always there watching. A whisper of sedition could bring a squad of them to a governor's door. Rebellion in the provinces was often stopped before it began simply because the alternative facing the immortals was too dreadful to consider. Even within the royal court, their presence was multifunctional. They acted as ceremonial guards during Norse festivals, coronations, and diplomatic receptions. But behind the scenes, they monitored courtiers, sniffed out treason, and enforced the king's will with silent efficiency. Some historians argue they acted almost like an internal intelligence agency, an ever-present warning that loyalty was not optional. This dual identity, warrior and envoy, enforcer and ornament, was part of their genius. Unlike most elite units of ancient times who lived for the glory of battle alone, the Immortals served a much broader imperial strategy. War was just one tool. Theirs was an empire held together not just by swords, but by symbols. The Immortals understood that fear and awe are siblings. In foreign courts and remote palaces, their arrival sent a clear message. The king is watching, the empire is eternal, and resistance is not worth the cost. And in this way, they fought wars without ever unshathing a blade. All empires age, and so do their legends. By the later years of the Aminid Empire, the Immortals were still feared, still respected, but no longer invincible. The machinery that had once made them immortal began to rust, not with a dramatic collapse, but with slow, creeping inefficiency. As Persian kings grew increasingly detached from the battlefield, more concerned with courtly luxury and intrigue, the Immortals too began to shift. From hardened warriors into royal ornaments under kings like Artaxerxes and Darius III, the elite guard still existed, still dressed the part, still marched in perfect formation. But cracks had formed. Recruitment standards slipped. Political favoritism began to seep into their ranks. Where once only the most disciplined and loyal men were selected, now nobles pulled strings to place unworthy sons into the sacred 10,000. The result was subtle but fatal. Uniformity without spirit, discipline without heart. This decay became tragically obvious when Alexander the Great launched his invasion of Persia in 334 BCE. At the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BCEE, the Immortals were deployed alongside the Persian center to defend Darius III. And although they fought with courage, they could not hold against the tactical brilliance and ruthless momentum of Alexander's Macedonian phalanx. They were outflanked, outmaneuvered, and overwhelmed. Worse yet, the myth didn't survive the battle. For centuries, the name Immortals had inspired awe, but Gaugamela proved they were no longer what they had been under Cyrus the Great or Xerxes I. The machinery of instant replacement faltered. The backup system that once made their losses invisible simply wasn't in place anymore. The unit never recovered. When Alexander marched into Peploa and took the royal palace, he walked into a shell of an empire. The Immortals weren't there to defend it. The unbroken line had finally been broken, but their story didn't end with defeat. Elements of the Immortals lived on. Alexander co-opted Persian traditions into his army. Later in the Sasanian Empire, a new elite force would rise, sometimes even called Immortals again by historians. Though not direct descendants, they echoed the original myth. 10,000 strong, elite, fearsome, eternal. Even in their fall, the Immortals left a blueprint. They had shown the world how to build not just an army, but a legend. The Persian Immortals may have vanished from the battlefield, but their influence never disappeared. Long after the fall of the Achaemenid Empire, the idea of an unbreakable elite fighting force remained lodged in the imagination of generals, kings, and storytellers alike. Their legend endured not because they won every battle, but because they represented something larger, the perfection of state-controlled power, an army that didn't age, didn't question, and didn't falter. When the Greeks described them, it was with a mix of awe and suspicion. Herodotus called them immortals, not because they could not be killed, but because they could not be seen to die. Their replacements were immediate, their presence eternal. To the Greeks, this was eerie, almost unnatural. They were used to war as a chaotic, personal affair. The immortals were something else, precise, faceless, disciplined to the edge of humanity. In Roman times, scholars still reference the immortals when speaking of ancient power. Even Byzantine historians noted the structure of the Persian elite guard as something to be admired. And in the early Islamic period, Arab historians recounted tales of the 10,000 who had once guarded kings of old, their spears glinting like a forest of silver under the desert sun. The concept would be revived again in the Sasanian Empire, where an elite cavalry corps, sometimes referred to by historians as the New Immortals, served as the empire's armored fist. Though not directly descended from the Achaemenid unit, they carried the same mission, embodying imperial invincibility. Even Napoleon Bonaparte, centuries later, studied Persian military organization and praised their structure. Culturally, the immortals seeped into myth. Modern media often misrepresents them, turning them into monsters, demons, or masked assassins. But the truth was far more compelling. They were human, terrifyingly human. Ordinary men turned into instruments of empire through relentless training, psychological control, and a deeply embedded system of continuity. They didn't need magic to become legendary, just consistency and silence. Their greatest weapon wasn't their sword, it was the idea that they were always coming, an eternal shadow on the horizon. And so the immortals live on in stone carvings, in battle doctrines, and in the whispered fears of those who know that power, when well organized and endlessly replaced, can become something very close to immortality. Before there were legends of Greek Amazon, there were the Scythians, nomadic warriors of the Eurasian steppe, feared and respected from the Black Sea to the Alai Mountains. Unlike most ancient societies, Scythian women didn't stay behind the tents weaving cloth or raising children. They rode horses, wielded bows, and went to war. And they didn't just accompany men into battle. They led and fought with lethal skill. These were not exceptions. This was the culture. Greek historians like Herodotus were stunned when they encountered these women. He described entire tribes where women refused to marry unless they had first killed an enemy in combat. His words, originally intended as exotic curiosities, have since found archaeological proof. Burial mounds called Koreans, scattered across Ukraine, Kazakhstan and southern Russia, have yielded astonishing finds. The skeletons of young women buried with bows, arrows, swords, and even battle-inflicted injuries. One such discovery revealed a woman with an arrowhead lodged in her spine, her body armored, her grave richly furnished. These weren't ceremonial weapons. They had been used, and so had she. Saiyan society was fundamentally different from its contemporaries. Life on the steppe demanded mobility and resilience. Everyone, male or female, had to ride, hunt, and defend the tribe. Girls learned archery as young as boys did. They wore the same leather trousers, the same armor. They even wore their hair and tattoos in similar fashion, indistinguishable on horseback under a storm of arrows. This created a warrior culture in which gender roles were fluid on the battlefield, but strict off it. A Saiyan woman could be deadly at full gallop and then return home to fulfill ritual and maternal duties. The two roles were not in conflict, they were complementary. Greek myths of the Amazon may have been inspired by exaggerated encounters with Saiyan women, but while the Amazon of myth vanished into fantasy, the Saiyans were real. They fought Persians, clashed with Greeks, and terrified the Macedonians. And for centuries, they roamed the steppe with fire and fury, men and women alike. In the small West African kingdom of Dahomey, modern-day Benin, an army of women once struck fear into European colonizers, rival kingdoms, and anyone foolish enough to underestimate them. They were known as the Aogi, but the French nicknamed them the Dahomey Amazon, comparison to the Greek myths. But these warriors were very real. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the Agagogi had become the standing royal guard of Domi's king. But they weren't just guards. They were elite infantry trained to kill, to defend, and to never retreat. Initially, they may have started as elephant hunters or palace attendants, but over time, they evolved into a formal, feared military force. Recruited as young girls, often chosen for their strength or spirit, the Agagogi were separated from families and placed into intense training. Discipline was total. They ran obstacle courses filled with thorns, sparred with real blades, and swore oaths of celibacy and absolute loyalty to the king. They wore braided sashes and carried muskets, machetes and clubs. But their deadliest weapon was psychological. European observers during the 19th century were shocked by their fearlessness and brutality. One French officer noted with unease how a Dahomey Amazon rushed forward, ripped open a man's throat, then calmly wiped her blade. These were not symbolic warriors. They were frontline shock troops used in raids, battles, and ambushes. During the Franco-Dahomean Wars in the 1890s, the Agogi went toe-to-toe with French colonial troops. Outnumbered and outgunned, they still launched night raids, executed ambushes, and fought street by street to defend their kingdom. Their tenacity forced French commanders to reconsider their tactics and their assumptions about gender in combat. But it wasn't just their battlefield success that mattered. The Dahomey Amazon existed in a deeply patriarchal world, and yet they carved out a space of total autonomy and influence. They advised kings, they performed ceremonial duties, and they shaped the kingdom's foreign policy, not from behind the scenes, but with blades in hand. Though the French ultimately defeated Domi, the legend of the Agogi never died. In fact, their legacy helped inspire modern fictional warriors like the Dora Milaje in Marvel's Black Panther. But truth, as always, is more impressive than fiction. In the shadowy pages of Japan's medieval history, one woman rides through blood and legend alike. Tomo Gozen, a samurai warrior of the late 12th century, she fought during the Genpei War, a brutal civil conflict between the Minamoto and Taira clans that gave birth to the first shogunate. Tomoe wasn't a symbolic figure or a passive consort. She was a commander, a swordswoman, and an archer trained in the deadly arts of the battlefield and feared for her precision in combat. Her story emerges most famously from the Hike Monogatari, a war epic that blends history with poetic flair. In it, Tomoe is described as especially beautiful with white skin, long hair, and charming features. But the next sentence drops the real thunder. She was also a remarkably strong archer, and as a swordswoman, she was a warrior worth 1,000. Beauty and lethality weren't contradictions, they were fused. Tomoe served under Minamoto no Yoshinaka, a warlord and her possible lover, during his campaign to seize control of Kyoto. She wasn't a camp follower or a battlefield nurse. She was in the thick of it, reportedly leading troops and even slaying multiple enemies in single combat. At the Battle of Owazu in 1184, facing encirclement by rival Minamoto forces, Yoshinaka ordered his last stand. Rather than flee, Tomoe chose to fight. In one of her most famous encounters, she's said to have dismounted a charging enemy horseman, wrestled him to the ground, and beheaded him on the spot. She then calmly remounted and continued into the chaos. That moment, possibly embellished, possibly true, has endured for centuries as a symbol of her unmatched composure and skill. But what happened to Tomo after the war remains a mystery. Some say she was captured and forced into marriage. Others say she became a nun, retreating into silence. Still others believe she vanished like a ghost back into the mists of legend. Whatever the truth, the legacy of Tomo Goen survived in theatre, folklore, and national memory. In a society built on rigid gender roles and patriarchal control, Tomo Goen stood apart, blade drawn, head high, and utterly unafraid. She wasn't just fighting for her lord, she was fighting for her right to exist in a world that told her she shouldn't. In the 1st century CE, the Roman Empire was at its peak, disciplined, organized, and seemingly unstoppable. But then came Boudicca, a flame-haired Celtic queen from Britannia who nearly brought the Roman machine to its knees. Her name would echo through history as a symbol of raw vengeance, national pride, and the terrifying force of a woman with nothing left to lose. Boudicca was the wife of Prasutagus, king of the Aini tribe in what is now eastern England. He was a client king under Rome, a puppet ruler allowed to maintain power as long as he kept the peace. But when Prasutagus died, Rome ignored his will and moved to seize his lands outright. In the process, Roman officials fagged Boudicca publicly and, according to Tacitus, raped her daughters. It was a brutal humiliation designed to crush rebellion. Instead, it lit a wildfire. In 60 or 61 CE, Boudicca united several British tribes and launched one of the most ferocious revolts in Roman history. And she wasn't a figurehead. Roman accounts describe her leading her army from a chariot, spear in hand, dressed in a flowing tunic and a massive gold torque around her neck. Her fiery hair streamed behind her as she rode, calling her people to war. She was part priestess, part general, and all fury. Her forces descended on Camillum, modern Colchester, burning it to the ground. Next came Londinium, the seed of modern London, where she slaughtered Roman colonists and razed the city. Historians estimate over 70,000 Romans and sympathizers were killed in just a few months. Her army left a trail of ash and shattered arrogance behind them. But the Romans under Governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus regrouped. Despite being vastly outnumbered, they lured Boudicca into a pitched battle where Roman discipline and formation tactics proved decisive. The rebellion was crushed. Boudicca, facing defeat, is said to have taken poison rather than be captured. Though her uprising failed, Boudicca's legacy only grew. Roman historians painted her as a barbarian, and yet one whose courage and leadership were impossible to ignore. For the British, especially in later centuries, she became a symbol of resistance against tyranny, both foreign and domestic. In the war-ravaged steppes of Central Asia during the golden age of Mongol expansion, there emerged a woman who terrified warriors and embarrassed princes, not with a sword, but with sheer physical dominance. Her name was Cutalune, and she was the great-great-granddaughter of none other than Genghis Khan. But she didn't just ride in his shadow. She carved out a legend of her own, one headlock at a time. Born around 12 and 60 CE, Cutalune was the daughter of Kaidu Khan, a powerful cousin of Kublai Khan and a rival claimant to leadership in the Mongol Empire. Cutalune was raised like a warrior prince, trained in archery, horse riding and battlefield tactics. But she stood out most for her talent in wrestling, a deeply respected and highly competitive sport among the Mongols. According to the Persian historian Rashid Alin, Cutalune vowed she would only marry a man who could beat her in a wrestling match. Many tried, all failed. Dozens of suitors walked away defeated and humiliated, some even wagering horses, gold or herds on their chances. It's said she amassed 10,000 horses from her victories, turning her into not just a champion, but one of the wealthiest women on the steppe. But Cutalune wasn't just tossing men onto the dirt for fun. She fought alongside her father in real battles, commanding troops and breaking enemy lines. During campaigns against both rival Mongol factions and Chinese forces, Cutalune was Kaidu's most trusted military advisor. He even considered naming her as his successor, an unprecedented move in a culture dominated by male warlords. This unsurprisingly sparked backlash. Some Mongol nobles whispered that her influence was unnatural, her power too threatening. In the end, Kaidu didn't make her his heir, choosing a male relative instead. But her reputation endured. Even Marco Polo, who traveled through the Mongol Empire, wrote of a Mongol princess who fought like a tiger and could ride and shoot as well as any man. Later, histories tried to romanticize or minimize her, turning her into a love-struck figure or reducing her story to legend. But make no mistake, Cutaloon was real and her strength was legendary. She proved that in the heart of the most male-dominated empire on earth, a woman could still rise, not because she was allowed to, but because no one could stop her. In a time when women couldn't vote, own land freely, or even wear men's clothing without risking arrest, one French teenager not only wore armor, she led armies. Navarre, born in 1412 in a tiny village called Domi, was an illiterate peasant girl. But by the age of 17, she would command troops, confront kings, and bend the course of the 100 Years' War between France and England. Her rise wasn't born from military training or noble lineage. Joan claimed divine inspiration. She said she heard voices, those of saints like Michael, Catherine, and Margaret, who told her that she had been chosen to drive the English from France and crown Charles the Dauphin as king. It was a wild claim, one that should have gotten her dismissed as mad. Instead, it got her an audience with the future King Charles III. The court tested her. Clergy grilled her for weeks, but somehow she passed. They saw something in her. Conviction, charisma, something unexplainable. And so, clad in white armor, her banner flying high, Joan was sent to Orléans, a besieged city that symbolized the war's turning point. French commanders were skeptical, but Joan's mere presence revitalized their spirit. She didn't just stand on the sidelines, she led charges, braved arrows, and rallied troops under fire. Against all odds, the French lifted the siege. The victory electrified the nation. Joan became known as the Maid of Orléans, a symbol of divine favor and patriotic resistance. After a string of victories, she escorted Charles to Rheims, where he was crowned king, just as the voices had foretold. But power, fame, and miracles come with enemies. In 1430, she was captured by Burgundian allies of the English. Tried by a pro-English ecclesiastical court, Joan was accused of heresy, witchcraft, and notably wearing male clothing, a crime punishable by death. She was just 19 when they burned her alive in Rouen marketplace, but her death only magnified her legend. Years later, the church reversed her conviction. Centuries later, she was canonized as a saint. By the time Nakano Tiko took up her naginata, a bladed polearm favored by samurai women, Japan was changing fast. It was the late 1860s, and the samurai class was being dismantled as the country modernized. But in one final stand for the old ways, this young woman would write herself into history as the last true onugata, female warrior of the samurai tradition. Nano was born in 1847 into a respected family of scholars and warriors. From a young age, she studied Confucian classics, calligraphy, and most importantly, martial arts. Her favorite weapon, the naginata, was more than just practical. It was symbolic. Traditionally used by women of the samurai class, it allowed for extended reach and graceful, fluid combat. Under the guidance of her adoptive father and martial arts master, she trained until her skill rivaled that of the best men in her domain. By her 20s, Nano had become both an educator and a warrior, teaching other women the ways of the sword. But in 1868, when the Boshin War broke out, a civil conflict between the imperial forces and the old Tokugawa shogunate, Nano didn't stay behind. She joined the defense of Aizu, one of the last bastions of traditional samurai resistance. Women were not officially allowed to serve, but Nano formed an unofficial unit of female fighters known as the Josh Tai, the women's army. Clad in hakama pants and traditional armor, these women fought fiercely alongside the men, protecting their families, their city, and their way of life. At the Battle of Aizu, Nano led her unit in hand-to-hand combat against imperial troops armed with rifles. According to witnesses, she killed several enemies before being shot in the chest. Knowing she was mortally wounded and unwilling to be captured or defiled, she asked her sister to behead her. Her body was buried at a temple in Fukushima, her sword beside her. Nano's bravery was legendary, even in defeat. Today, statues of her stand in Japan, particularly in Aizu, where she's remembered not only as a warrior, but as a woman who refused to bow to modernity, to patriarchy, or to death itself. In the smouldering ruins of World War II, one name sent shivers down the spines of German soldiers on the Eastern Front: Lyudmila Pavlichenko, nicknamed Lady Death by her enemies. She wasn't a myth, a morale booster, or a propaganda figure. She was the real thing. A Soviet sniper who tallied 309 confirmed kills, including 36 enemy snipers. She was the most lethal female sniper in recorded history. Born in 1916 in what is now Ukraine, Pavlichenko was competitive from a young age. She was fiercely patriotic and a natural marksman. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, she was just 24 years old and studying history at university. But instead of books, she picked up a rifle and volunteered for the Red Army. Officials initially suggested she become a nurse. She refused. She wanted a combat role, and she got one. Deployed to the front lines during the siege of Odessa and later the siege of Sevastopol, Pavlichenko earned her reputation the hard way. She spent long hours motionless, camouflaged in freezing terrain, waiting for the perfect shot. Her targets weren't just foot soldiers. She hunted officers, machine gunners, and rival snipers. She operated with nerves of steel, patience bordering on supernatural, and an absolute hatred for the invaders. Her kill count climbed so high she was pulled from the front and sent on a diplomatic tour of the United States, Canada, and the UK. There she met President Franklin D. Roosevelt and formed a friendship with Elena Roosevelt, who admired her composure and intellect. Pavlichenko gave speeches urging the Allies to open a second front in Europe, and mocking reporters who asked her sexist questions about makeup and skirt length. After the war, she didn't retreat into obscurity. She earned her degree, became a historian, and trained future generations of Soviet snipers. Though she suffered from war-related trauma and injuries, her legacy endured. She received the Hero of the Soviet Union medal and remains a national hero in both Russia and Ukraine. In a world that often doubts the place of women in war, Lyudmila Pavlichenko didn't argue. She didn't protest. She simply did the job better than almost anyone who ever lived. For every famous name, Budaka, Tomoygozin, Lyudmila Pavlichenko, there are countless others whose stories have slipped through the cracks of mainstream history. History, after all, was largely written by men. And when women picked up swords, rifles, or spears, they were often omitted, downplayed, or turned into myth. But make no mistake, warrior women have been there all along, across continents, across centuries, and their silence was not voluntary. Consider the Trung sisters of Vietnam, Trung Trac and Trungyi, who led a rebellion against Chinese occupation in the 1st century CE. They rode elephants into battle, rallied thousands of followers, and ruled an independent state for 3 years before being crushed by superior Chinese forces. Their resistance is still commemorated today with temples and festivals in their honor, even though global history books rarely mention them, or the Ya Asantewaa of the Ashanti Empire in West Africa, who in 1900 led a rebellion against British colonial forces. As Queen Mother, she rallied her people when the British demanded the sacred golden stool, the symbol of Ashanti sovereignty. She delivered fiery speeches and led her troops in battle, showing that leadership and defiance knew no gender. There were Viking shield maidens, likely not as common as legend suggests, but very much present. Archaeological finds confirm that women were buried with weapons, armor, and even war horses, not as ceremonial tokens, but as warriors. There were Apache women fighters in the American Southwest, like Lausanne, a spiritual warrior who rode and fought beside her brother, the famous leader Victoria. In every era, in every region, warrior women fought, not always to conquer, but to protect, to defend their families, their cultures, their homes. Some led armies, others fought as lone figures in resistance movements. Some were queens, some were peasants, but all shattered the lie that war belonged to men alone. Today, their legacy is being reclaimed. From scholarly research to pop culture representations, the stories of these women are finally resurfacing. And each rediscovered name is a reminder. History is not just what was written, it's also what was erased. These women didn't ask to be remembered, they asked to be respected, and slowly the world is beginning to listen. In the heart of ancient Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, music wasn't just entertainment. It was ritual, power, and language, and no instrument embodied this more than the lyre. Among the world's earliest stringed instruments, the Mesopotamian lyre dates back over 4,500 years, emerging from the Sumerian city of where music was woven into both temple ceremony and royal court life. The lyres weren't simple harps carved from wood. They were intricate, beautifully crafted objects, often adorned with gold, silver, lapis lazuli, and detailed animal motifs. One of the most famous examples is the bull-headed lyre, discovered in a royal tomb in the 1920s by Sir Leonard Woolley. Its soundbox was shaped like a bull's body, and the instrument's head was covered in gold leaf, its beard made of lapis. But this wasn't just for show. The bull was a symbol of strength, and its presence on a lyre may have been spiritual, not decorative. Played with the fingers or a small plerum, the lyre produced a resonant, haunting tone. Though we can't hear ancient melodies exactly as they were, scholars believe the Sumerians used a heptonic scale, 7 notes, much like modern Western music. Clay tablets inscribed with early musical notation provide tantalizing clues, showing that music theory and scale construction existed even then. These lyres weren't confined to palace halls. In temples, music accompanied offerings and prayers to the gods. Hymns were sung with lyre accompaniment in honor of deities like Inanna and Enlil, turning music into a sacred bridge between human and divine. In Inerary rites, lyres mourned the dead, helping guide souls into the afterlife. They weren't just instruments, they were voices of transition and transformation. Mesopotamian musicians held a respected role in society. Some were female priestesses, others were court performers. They memorized complex songs passed down orally, often learning from a young age within structured schools for scribes and musicians. Today, replicas of these ancient lyres are played in museums and reconstructions. Their soft, twanging echoes reminding us that long before Mozart, before medieval minstrels, or even Homer's sung epics, humans were plucking strings in the desert, chasing beauty and sound. While the lyre sang gently to the gods, the oos screamed, wept, and danced through the hearts of the ancient Greeks. This reed-lone double-piped wind instrument was no gentle flute. It was wild, emotional, and unrelenting. To the Greeks, music wasn't just entertainment. It was ethos, a force that shaped the soul, and the allos embodied its most primal edge. Unlike the lyre, which symbolized harmony and order favored by Apollo, the allos was associated with Dionysus, god of wine, ecstasy, and madness. It was often played during rituals, dramatic performances, and military marches, giving it a range of emotional and functional uses. It consisted of 2 pipes, usually made of wood, bone, or ivory, each with its own reed and fingering holes. The musician, or it played both pipes simultaneously, producing a dense, penetrating sound closer to a bagpipe than a modern flute. This required incredible breath control. Musicians often used a technique called circular breathing, inhaling through the nose while pushing air out through the cheeks, allowing them to play continuously. The effort warped their faces and puffed their cheeks so much so that athletes sometimes mocked all-it players for their awkward appearance. Yet despite the jokes, all its players were respected, even revered in certain circles. The olos was not for calm background music. It stirred the blood in ancient Greek theatre. It accompanied tragedies and comedies, adding mood and momentum to performances by Sophocles and Euripides. In battle, it kept hoplites marching in step, its blaring voice slicing through the chaos. And during Bacchic rituals, it pushed dancers into trance-like states, dissolving the line between performer and possessed. Plato had a complicated relationship with the Owos in his Republic. He famously dismissed it as too emotionally overwhelming, preferring instruments like the lyre and kithara for their intellectual clarity. Yet even he couldn't deny its power. The Owos could simulate sorrow, mimic fury, or stir euphoria, sometimes all in the same breath. Today, fragments of ancient alloy survive in museums, and modern reconstructions hint at its raw energy. Unlike the mathematically balanced lyre, the allos wasn't about perfection, it was about release. It carried the sound of frenzy, mourning, seduction, and war. In the ancient courts and scholar studios of China, music was more than art. It was philosophy in motion, and few instruments embody this more than the guin and the guzheng, two stringed zithers that carried the sounds of dynasties, meditation, and poetic introspection. They may look similar at a glance, but each served a distinct role in shaping China's musical identity. The guin is the elder of the two, an instrument with over 3,000 years of history. With 7 strings and a long, fretless wooden body, it produced quiet, subtle tones. To the untrained ear, the guqin sounds almost whisper-like, gentle slides, harmonics, and plucked notes that echo like raindrops on old tile. But to Chinese scholars and sages, these sounds reflected the balance between heaven and earth. Confucius himself was said to play the guin, believing it cultivated moral character and inner harmony. In ancient China, learning to play the guin wasn't about becoming a performer, it was about becoming civilized. Contrast this with the guzheng, a younger, louder cousin with a brighter sound and more public life. With 16 to 21 strings or more in modern versions, the guzheng was built for performance. Its curved wooden frame and movable bridges allow for rich melodies and dramatic glissandos. Musicians pluck the strings with pli attached to their fingers, creating cascades of notes that shimmer like flowing water. It was favored in palaces, folk music, and even military camps. Where the guin whispered to the soul, the guzheng sang to the crowd. Both instruments had roles in ritual and storytelling. The guin often accompanied poetry readings, philosophical lectures, and meditation. The guzheng was used in banquets, operas, and to recount historical epics. Its music could mimic galloping horses, flowing rivers, or weeping lovers, all through vibrating silk strings and masterful fingerwork. These instruments also represented gendered spaces in ancient China. The guin was traditionally played by male scholars, while the guzheng became more associated with female performers, especially in later dynasties. Yet both were respected, taught in musicalmes, and written into the Confucian ideals of balanced education. Today, both guin and guzheng are still played, revived in classical and contemporary settings alike. They remain living echoes of China's ancient soul, where music was not only heard, but felt as a path to virtue and emotional depth. In ancient Egypt, music wasn't background noise. It was a sacred tool, a form of divine communication that echoed through temples, tombs, and daily life. From pharaohs to peasants, music was everywhere. It soothed laborers, honored the dead, guided religious rituals, and entertained the living. And the instruments that shaped this soundscape were as diverse as the Nile itself. One of the oldest and most iconic Egyptian instruments was the harp. Early harps, curved like bows, evolved into larger angular harps that stood as tall as a man. These instruments were plucked with the fingers, often by temple musicians or court entertainers. Harps weren't just for art, they were associated with the afterlife. Tomb paintings often show harpists playing for the souls of the dead, easing their journey into eternity. Then came the siren, a sacred rattle associated with the goddess Hathor, protector of music, motherhood, and joy. Made of metal with loose crossbars, the siren produced a jangling sound when shaken. It wasn't subtle, but it was powerful. Used in temples to summon gods, purify spaces, and drive out evil spirits. The shaking of a siren was believed to please deities and maintain cosmic order. Flutes often made from reed or bone added breathy melodies to processions and rituals. The double clarinet with two pipes played simultaneously created a rich buzzing harmony, a predecessor of the owos of Greece. Percussion came through frame drums, hand clappers, and even castanets, especially in dances and festivals. Professional musicians in Egypt held respected positions. Many were women depicted in art as harpists and singers, often serving temples. These women were more than entertainers. They were chantresses of Ammon, musicians of Isis, figures of spiritual power. Music could honor gods, accompany offerings, and mark the transition between life and death. Egyptian notation remains elusive. Unlike Mesopotamia or Greece, few musical records survive, but their instruments depicted vividly in tombs and temples tell us enough. Ancient Egyptians understood music as structure, emotion, and magic. Even in death, music was essential. Instruments were buried with the elite, their owners believing they'd play again in the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise. To them, music wasn't a pastime, it was eternity's language. Long before written words etched history into stone, ancient African cultures used something far more primal and immediate: rhythm. Across the continent, drums weren't just instruments, they were voices. They spoke, commanded, remembered, and summoned. In Africa's ancient societies, music, especially percussion, was a living, breathing language that carried stories, laws, identities, and the pulse of the divine. Drums varied by region and purpose, but one of the most iconic was the talking drum found in West Africa. Shaped like an hourglass and strung with leather cords, this drum could mimic the tonal language of the people. Skilled drummers could speak entire phrases by adjusting tension on the cords while striking it with a curved stick. Messages were sent across villages announcing births, deaths, warnings, or royal summons. Long before the invention of paper or the postal system, the drum became the continent's first wireless communication system. But drums weren't just practical, they were spiritual. In kingdoms like ancient Kush and No, drums summoned ancestors and deities. In Efa and Benin, they honored kings and gods in elaborate court rituals. Drumming was central to initiation ceremonies, healing rituals, and funerals. It was said that to beat a sacred drum was to awaken forces beyond the veil. African drums came in countless forms: djembe, dundun, bugarabu, and kedi, each with specific roles in the musical hierarchy. They were carved from single logs, carefully hollowed and fitted with animal hide, each tuned to a specific pitch or tone. The craftsmanship was sacred, passed down from father to son with rituals even during the making of the instrument, and percussion didn't stop at drums. Rattles, bells, shakers, and thumb pianos added layers of rhythm and melody, creating a complex polyrhythmic soundscape that Western music wouldn't fully understand until centuries later. In African tradition, music was inseparable from movement. You didn't just listen, you danced, breathed, sweated with it. The drummer wasn't a performer. He was a conduit channeling energy, spirit, and communal memory. These rhythms traveled through the trans-Saharan trade, through the Nile, and later through the Atlantic slave trade, shaping diasporic music from Brazil to the Caribbean. But their heart was always Africa, where the beat wasn't entertainment. It was identity, ancestry, and survival. High in the Andean mountains, where the air thins and the clouds brush the earth, Music floated through the stone cities and terrace fields, not from string or drum, but from wind. Ancient Andean civilizations like the Nazca, Moche, and Inca developed a rich musical tradition centered around aerophones, flutes, whistles, and most famously, panpipes or secu. The secu is a deceptively simple-looking instrument. Multiple reeds or bamboo tubes of varying lengths lashed together in a row or stacked in double rows. Each tube plays one note, and players alternate rapidly between rows to create melodies. The result is a haunting, breathy harmony that echoes across mountains like a conversation with the wind itself. Siu ensembles were often played in pairs. Two players performing alternating notes in interlocking patterns, a technique called hocketing, which symbolized the Andean ideal of duality and balance in nature and society. Flutes made of bone, clay, or reed were also widespread. Some so small they could hang from necklaces, others large enough to produce deep, resonant tones. Many were carved in the shapes of birds, snakes, or spirits, showing the spiritual link between sound and the natural world. These weren't just musical instruments. They were sacred tools. Music was used to call rain, bless harvests, honor the sun, or communicate with ancestors. One particularly fascinating find is the ceramic whistling vessels of the Masha civilization. When water was poured into them, internal chambers forced air through a whistle, producing eerie tones, literally musical pottery. These were likely used in rituals, combining water, air, and sound into a single ceremonial act. In Inca society, music accompanied every stage of life, from birth celebrations to funerals, from military parades to agricultural festivals. There was a melody for every moment. Inca musicians played for gods like Ini, the sun, and Pachamama, the earth, offering their breath as a form of spiritual devotion. Even soldiers marched with coordinated flute music, turning warfare into ritual choreography. Though Spanish colonization nearly erased many native traditions, the sound of Andean flutes never fully vanished. Today, their echoes can still be heard in Peruvian highlands and Bolivian villages, an ancient voice of stone, wind, and sky still singing in the thin air. In ancient India, music was more than a performance. It was cosmic engineering. According to Hindu philosophy, the universe itself was created from sound, from the primordial vibration known as Om. From this belief grew one of the world's most intricate and enduring musical traditions, rooted in ritual, mathematics, and spiritual transformation. Early texts like the Vedas, dating back to at least 1500 BCE, already contain hymns known as Saman chants, which were meant to be sung, not just recited. These hymns formed part of sacred rituals with specific melodies designed to align the soul with divine forces. The priestly caste, the Brahmins, were trained not only in philosophy and fire offerings, but in voice modulation and musical cadence. Precision was essential. Mispronouncing a note could, in theory, corrupt the ritual. The earliest instruments used in Vedic and post-Vedic India served both sonic and symbolic roles. The Vienna, a plucked string instrument with a resonating gourd, became a symbol of learning and divine expression. It was and still is associated with the goddess Saraswati, the deity of wisdom and the arts. Its strings were said to echo the vibrations of the cosmos, allowing the player to connect with universal truths through melody. Wind instruments like the Bansuri bamboo flute were not only tools of melody, but vehicles of myth. Lord Krishna, the god of love and divine play, was often depicted playing the flute, charming humans and animals alike. The sound of the Bansuri was believed to pierce the illusions of reality, Maya, and transport listeners to a higher state of consciousness. Percussion also held immense power. The midangam and taba weren't just rhythm keepers. They mirrored heartbeats, breath patterns, and cosmic cycles. Rhythms or talus were complex mathematical patterns, some cyclical, some asymmetrical, each linked to emotional states and times of day. Indian music was deeply tied to rasa theory, the belief that music should evoke specific emotional flavors like love, heroism, serenity, or sorrow. Even in ancient times, ragas, melodic frameworks, were designed to stir the soul and guide meditation. Unlike many ancient traditions lost to time, India's musical roots have not only survived, they've evolved. But at their core remains the same ancient belief that to make music is to touch the divine. In the ancient cities of Mesoamerica, from the towering pyramids of Teotihuacan to the ceremonial plazas of the Mir and Aztecs, music was inseparable from the sacred. It wasn't just art, it was power used to speak to gods, sanctify blood offerings, summon rain, and terrify enemies. For the peoples of Mesoamerica, music was ritual technology, an invisible thread linking humans to the divine and the dead. Drums dominated the soundscape. The most iconic was the huetl, a tall, single-headed drum carved from hollowed tree trunks and played with bare hands. Covered in animal skins and adorned with glyphs or sacred images, the huetl throbbed during festivals, warfare, and sacrifices. Its deep, resonant sound echoed through stone courtyards like the heartbeat of the gods. Then came the tionasti, a slit drum made of hollowed wood played with rubber-tipped mallets. Its surface was carved into two tongues that produced different pitches when struck. The tionasti wasn't just percussive, it could speak. In Nahuatl, the Aztec language, it was said that tionasti could sing the names of deities or the rhythms of fate itself. Wind instruments were also central. Flutes made of bone, clay, and reed were common, often shaped like animals or gods. Some were so intricately made that they could mimic bird calls, jaguar growls, or human screams. In fact, the infamous Aztec death whistle, shaped like a skull and blown like a flute, produces a blood-chilling shriek, possibly used during war or sacrificial ceremonies to strike terror into enemies or open portals to the spirit world. Music accompanied every major event: birth, coming-of-age rites, warfare, agricultural cycles, and death. Musicians and dancers trained in special schools, performing not just for crowds, but for the gods. Certain instruments were reserved for nobles or priests. Playing them incorrectly could be considered a spiritual offense. Even sacrifice, central to Aztec religion, was carried out to a musical score. Drums pounded, flutes wailed, and conch shells howled while hearts were offered to the sun. The music didn't soothe, it activated. It guided souls, fed gods, and kept the cosmic engine turning. In Mesoamerica, music wasn't a backdrop. It was the ceremony. It wasn't meant to entertain, it was meant to transform. Though the civilizations of antiquity have risen and fallen, their music has never truly died. It lingers, not always in sound, but in ritual, design, and cultural DNA. In many ways, ancient music was never meant to be preserved in sheet music or captured in recordings. It was passed through hands, mouths, and hearts. A living tradition encoded in memory and performance. Take the Chinese gene or Indian vena. These aren't museum pieces. They're still played today, often using techniques that have been passed down for millennia. Performers don't just mimic ancient sounds. They embody them. Each note carries centuries of philosophy, culture, and meditation. In a single pluck you can feel the same longing or joy that an emperor or sage once felt. In Africa, the drums still speak. The rhythms of the gamba, the call and response of go, the syncopation of dance, all echo ancient practices that predate colonial maps or written history. Even in the Americas, the haunting breath of the Andean siku or the thunder of powwow drums among indigenous tribes reflects echoes of ancestral voices. Some instruments are direct descendants, others are inspired reinventions, but the roots are ancient. Even in modern Western music, ancient concepts survive. The 7-note heptonic scale used in Mesopotamia laid a foundation for modern harmony. Greek music theory, modes, intervals, ethos fed into early Christian chant and the eventual birth of classical music and the instruments. The lyre became the lute, which birthed the guitar. The Olos's double reed design inspired the oboe and bassoon. But perhaps the most enduring legacy is the purpose of ancient music. It wasn't meant to sell tickets or top charts. It was ritual, it was healing. It marked birth and death, sowing and harvest, love and war. It meant something. Even today, music remains our universal language, able to stir emotion without words, to create community without walls. In a digital world overflowing with noise, ancient music reminds us that sound can be sacred, that rhythm can be memory and melody, a thread between worlds. Whether whispered from a guin, shouted through a war drum, or piped from a clay flute, the songs of our ancestors still echo. We just have to listen.